Hey guys, thanks for joining me again today. Sorry that we have to do it in this format, but it is what it is. So today we are going to have our first virtual lesson, first virtual lecture on World War II. We've progressed in the classroom to the point where I think the last thing we discussed in the class was the Holocaust and Hitler's takeover of Europe. And what he had started doing over there. Today marks kind of a turning point in our notes because we will see the attack on Pearl Harbor, picture you can see in the background here. We will see the expansion of the Japanese Empire. And, after Pearl Harbor, we're going to take a look at some of the reactions that were had by Americans and the American government. We'll see the beginning of the Japanese American internment camps. And we're going to have a lot of domestic impacts that we focus on. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me pull up the slideshow. Okay, there we go. Move this around as need be. All right. Well, so the war has begun in the Pacific, and we've talked about the fighting there. Make sure that we're still recording. Yep, we're good. We've talked about how the Japanese have been at war really since 1931. Remember that they invaded China, specifically Manchuria. They had taken Korea previously as a colony earlier on, but the Chinese had been fighting at the point we're about to pick up the story for about a decade, better part of a decade. So, they are going to be running low on some major resources. And if you remember that simulation we did a couple weeks ago, where you guys acted as if you were a country making decisions, and ultimately you got placed in a similar scenario to what Japan was facing at this time, running low on resources, and especially some of the policies we're going to see coming from the United States, how that began to affect the Japanese war effort. But remember that ultimately the attack on Pearl Harbor, it kind of made sense when you took all of that together, that Japan had been fighting for an extremely long time, that they were running low on resources, especially after this embargo we're about to discuss. It made sense that this was coming, but I'll tell you, this is a major turning point of the war because with the introduction of the United States into this war, and remember, the people of the U.S. have not wanted to be in this war. We talked last time about how 70% of Americans had regretted World War I, and that is still very real to them. The America First organization pushing the idea of this anti-war message, pacifism on the rise. So this attack, though, changes everything. The America First movement goes out the window. I mean, we are attacked at Pearl Harbor, and it changes everything. We get involved in this war head on, and I'll tell you, it's the jolt that the Allies needed. I don't know if they win the war without U.S. support. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump into it. So we'll start there with letter A. Japan expands into Asia. And I do want to pause and just remind you that for students watching, guys, please make sure that you are taking notes just like you would in class. I'll remind you that at the end of the week, I will have you guys posting your notes so I can see that you've been following along as we've been reviewing these topics. So it is up to you to do that. So please make sure you continue to take handwritten notes, not allowed to type. Okay, so Japan expands into Asia. So that initial invasion in 1931 into Manchuria, what we've seen over the last few years is that they're pushing deeper and deeper into China. We had talked about the rape of Nanking a couple weeks ago, and just the horrific nature in which the Japanese took over that major city. So by 1940, Japan has made its way down into French Indochina. I don't know if you can see my cursor down here, but French Indochina. They've even launched attacks here, and today this is Vietnam. So after the French leave, they do rename it Vietnam. But by 1940, Japan's invaded French Indochina. to try and stop imports into China, to try and stop the basically the backing up of the Chinese government. So but the war is it's costly for the Japanese, especially in terms of resources. The leadership estimated that, according to their best guess, um, especially after the U.S. oil embargo, which I'm about to discuss. After that point, they have less than 2 years of oil reserves remaining. They're going to have to make some choices. So, like I said, that U.S. oil embargo. I'll remind you that an embargo is when a nation stops trading with another nation. So the most famous one, I believe, that the United States has is with Cuba. All right, you probably heard Cuban cigars are illegal. That's why, is because the embargo that was placed during the Cold War. Well, in this scenario, the United States government places an oil embargo on the nation and empire of Japan. We cut off all oil supplies. Now, that might shock you to hear that we were selling oil to the Japanese, but remember, we were neutral up until this point. We had passed a series of neutrality acts. So, even though we had started to cut off reserves to aggressive nations, and Japan was one of those, we solidified the policy that we would stop selling oil to them in 1940. So it's at that point that the Japanese really start to really take stock and realize that they're going to be in some deep trouble come soon if they no longer have any oil. So they're going to be looking to expand. Once again, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but I'm highlighting the southern area of the Netherlands, the Netherland Indies. So this area that today is Indonesia and the Philippines, all this stuff, especially for this area down here. There's some oil reserves that the Japanese had their eyes on, but here's the deal: you cannot attack those areas out of the blue unless you want repercussions from the U.S. Navy. Remember that at this time, the Philippines is a U.S. colony. Okay, they are a U.S. territory. They are owned by the United States, and we have thousands of servicemen in 1940 that are located in the Philippines. If the Japanese start launching attacks around the Philippines and we're basically surrounded, that's going to put us into a tough situation that we will probably have to strike back upon. So the Japanese understand this, and they're kind of working backwards here. Okay, so if we got to get the oil, then we have to neutralize the threat, and that threat is the United States Navy. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan would launch an attack on the United States. It began around 8 a.m. Hawaiian time, and this attack was launched from six aircraft carriers with over 350 aircrafts that were sent in multiple waves. There were actually 2 waves of aircraft that came and attacked Pearl Harbor. If you look at the photograph in the bottom right, this is actually a photograph from a Japanese aircraft during the attack. You can see here what's called Battleship Row, and you can see that a couple of these dive bombers have actually launched their torpedoes and are attacking these battleships. Those battleships were the main target. That is what they were going after. If the Japanese could take out our battleships and take out the vast majority of our Navy, they're looking. They really thought that they could take us out of the war. Their estimates were about 2 years, I believe. I will tell you that even though they are somewhat successful in this attack, their estimate is way off. Thankfully, many of our aircraft carriers were out to sea that day, and instead of our Navy taking 2 years to recover, it'll take about 3 months. But back to the attacks themselves. The attack on Pearl Harbor, I do want to mention just I guess personal story here. My grandfather had joined the Navy as a young man before the war began, and he found himself stationed at Pearl Harbor. He was in the Navy and was actually there at Pearl Harbor that day. I believe from what I've been told, the ships down here on the lower left hand corner, I believe that second one was the Sicard, which was the ship my grandfather was on. But I remember as a little boy, uh, him telling me stories about seeing the Japanese Zeros going overhead, and the ships being on fire. They basically checked into their ship, and then since they weren't directly being attacked, they were sent to go help other ships. I remember as a little boy being fascinated by that. And as I've gotten older, I've remembered that story differently, because as a little boy you're wrapped up in the excitement of what's happening. Um, I think it was later as an adult when my mom told me that a lot of the stories my grandfather shared with me she had never heard, and um, you know the only reasoning there that many of those stories were probably too painful in the years following these events for my grandfather to share. It wasn't until later life. Sadly, my grandfather's passed on, but I vividly remember that. But as I said, as I've gotten older, I've thought about the fact that you know this this was a tragedy that he was experiencing as a young man. To actually witness the murder of U.S. Soldiers, sailors during this period. It was absolutely tragic, and there are many men, those that did survive this day, that were scarred for the rest of their lives. They never forgot it. They never did. I'll take this opportunity to remind you that we always talk about war in with nice little bookends. Well, the war started this year and it ended this year. That is not the case for anyone that's actually involved in the war, for the soldiers, for the civilians that encounter war, for the people that are wounded, that carry, a loss of a limb with them for the rest of their lives. War is a tragic thing. And at the end of it, even though there may be heroics and there may be exciting tales that emerge, at the end of the day, it's about death and destruction. I guess the big lesson is always to remember war should be a last option. We always need to try and work through things diplomatically, because there's war is necessary sometimes. I mean, the Japanese Empire, the Nazi Empire, they had to be destroyed. But could actions and diplomacy have taken place beforehand to try and end that? I would like to think so, but again, kind of second guessing there. But war always ends in deaths, and often of the innocent. So just my soapbox there. So thanks for dealing with that. Now let's talk about the impact that the attack on Pearl Harbor had. There were, of those 8 battleships, we'll start there, that I talked about earlier. They were all damaged, first of all, but only 4 of them were sunk. Now, that's a tremendous loss. I mean, that represents a good percentage of the battleships that the U.S. had in its stock at this time. But still, that the fact that the Japanese were unable to sink all of our battleships, that our aircraft carriers were out to sea, we really escaped this quite lucky in terms of loss of ships. Now, sadly, this would be one of the worst days in American history for loss of American lives. There would be 2,403 Americans that would lose their lives, that were killed in the attacks. And I've just another quick soapbox. I've always said one reason I love history is because I always think about the what ifs. I mentioned at the beginning of this that the Japanese had sent in 2 waves of fighters into attack Pearl Harbor, and also mentioning my grandfather down on the ground actually helping put out fires and rescue guys out of the bay. I always wonder what happens if they send in that 3rd wave. Ultimately, there's a very real opportunity and chance that my grandfather could have been, number 2,404. And if that's the case, I'm not here lecturing to you guys today. That's for sure. About how much history can change on a single decision. A Japanese general, 80 years ago, making a pivotal decision that perhaps even led to this moment. So, history is an amazing thing. So, anyways, like I said, the Japanese somewhat successful attack, but ultimately it really doomed them because it brought us into the war. They did not damage our navy nearly as much as they thought they would, and they basically were able to unite the American people behind this cause immediately. Moving on to letter C, the Bataan Death March. The exact same day that Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched, December 7th, 1941, there were other attacks. In fact, if you listen to FDR's address, he says, he goes through and he lists all the places that had been attacked alongside Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. There were attacks in the Philippines, okay, which is what we're about to discuss. There were attacks in British holdings of Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong. All those areas are attacked on December 7th. So this was a well-coordinated, very broad attack that spanned literally, hundreds of miles. The Philippines, though, as I said, the U.S. had a number of U.S. soldiers that were there based in the Philippines. It was one of our largest military bases outside the continental United States. And the Japanese laid an assault on the Philippines in which the United States were able to hold off for about 4 months. But in April, the American forces, alongside the Filipino forces, they would have to surrender to the Japanese. There were approximately somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Filipino and American soldiers that were taken captive as POWs. And if you look in the picture in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see here a photo taken from this event. This is days after the Japanese have conquered the Philippines. And you can see the smile on the faces of the soldiers, the Japanese soldiers. As for the Americans and the Filipinos that were taken captive, the Japanese displayed some of that brutality I've been discussing in this moment. They took their captives and they forced them to march, some of them up to 60 miles to what amount to concentration camps. And this forced march was extremely brutal. We're talking, extreme heat. We're talking about, again, 60 miles, trying to walk from Kansas City to, I don't know, basically Columbia, Missouri. Many of these guys, are low on supplies. Some of them didn't even have shoes on. If you were an American POW here that tripped and fell, or tried to run, the Japanese killed you on the spot. There was no question. In fact, they would even kill people just for sport, just for fun. And we saw some of that with the descriptions of the rape of Nanking. Absolutely brutal mentality that the Japanese army had at this time. 10,000 Americans would die in the Bataan Death March, and again, one of the deadliest events in U.S. history. Those that did make it to the end and were placed in those camps, many of them were in those camps for the remainder of the war. Many of them died in those camps because of lack of food, lack of water, lack of sanitation. Many were tortured, and many were executed. So, the beginning of World War II, again, we like to remember all the heroics and, knowing that ultimately we're going to win this war. We love talking about that stuff. We're seeing a tremendous amount of blood and death in the opening scenes of this war for the United States. And we always need to keep that in mind. Moving on to the next page here. Let's take a look at what's happening here in back home in the United States as this war starts to play out. The domestic impacts of the war, and first I want to start off with the political impacts. In February 1942, that's 3 months after Pearl Harbor, President FDR makes one of what I consider his worst decisions as president, and that is signing Executive Order 9066. Okay, I would write that down. Executive Order 9066. And what this executive order, which in some ways kind of amounts to a law, it had to be followed. What this executive order did, if you look in the bottom portion here, this flyer kind of says it all. It instructed all persons of Japanese ancestry. Notice I did not say Japanese citizen. Okay, these are American citizens that this law applies to, that this executive order applies to. What this called for was the detention, the arrest, and the concentration in internment camps of all Japanese American citizens on the West Coast. It's shocking to think that this would happen, because many of the people that we are discussing here, all of them, for the most part, are American citizens, and some of them are third and fourth generation American citizens. This would be, I know many of you, in my classroom probably have, regardless of where you're from, whether, and family ancestries from Germany or Japan, whatever. Imagine us going to war today with a nation like Germany, and they passed a law saying that anyone with German blood in their family tree is now being detained. Okay, now there was fear, and fear is the big theme here, because this executive order is put in place because they are afraid that there are Japanese loyal people on the West Coast that are communicating with the Japanese. They believe that there may be spies along the West Coast, and this executive order is signed to try and prevent any coordination between those on the ground and in the United States and the Japanese Empire. In reality, there was extremely little disloyalty among the Japanese Americans. There were very, I can't say that I've ever even come across any examples of Japanese spies on the ground. I know there were some at Pearl Harbor, but in California, I can't say that I've ever come across a single example of that. So think of what's about to happen here. All told, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of American citizens that will be sent off to internment camps, okay, concentrated in certain areas. Now, I do want to pause and say that the comparisons to the concentration camps of the Nazis, this is where it ends. Those were death camps, and yes, while many there were some Japanese Americans that died in these camps, please understand that these internment camps were not execution camps. They were not death camps that were put in place to actually wipe these people out. They were being held against their will because of their ancestry. So I don't want to have any parallels with what's happening over in Europe at this exact same time. Let's look at some of these numbers, though. There were about 110,000 American citizens on the West Coast of Japanese American ancestry. 62% of them were full American citizens. Okay, meaning that they had, some of them have lived in the U.S. for generations. 80,000 of those were what we call NISEI, okay, which NISEI, excuse the pronunciation there, which were second generation, okay, second generation, or Sansei, which were third generation, okay. 80,000 of the 110,000 were second or third generation. These people had been here. This is the only home that they have ever known. They were born in America, just like you and me, And these people were arrested because of who their grandparents were. Um, to me, this is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, um, but it is such an important lesson for us to understand the fear out of this attack from Pearl Harbor, what it turned around and directly led to the violation of these people's civil rights. It's disgusting, and we have to be careful because when we are fearful, we often give up our civil rights, and we've seen this time and time again. We saw it in Germany, as we lectured earlier, after the burning of the Reichstag. And I would argue you saw it after 9/11 with the passage of the Patriot Act. These kind of things happen when we are fearful. We often sign away our rights, and we have to be well aware of that, especially at a time where I'm lecturing from home because of the coronavirus. So let's make sure that we keep rational heads and we follow instructions, but make sure that our politicians don't begin violating our civil rights in any way. All right, the camps. Let's talk about these camps. There were 10 internment camps that existed throughout the western part of the United States. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them, a couple of the largest. Tule Lake, Tule Lake, and that was in California. There were almost 19,000 people detained. That was the largest of the internment camps. Postone, which was in Arizona, that was another large one, about 18,000, and that is Poston. Again, I apologize if pronunciations are off, but about 18,000 people in those. Now, you might be thinking, how could they get away with this? How could they just arrest tens of thousands of American citizens who have shown no ill will towards the United States, who have there's no evidence that they are directing any attacks. There's nothing. How can you just arrest them? Well, it was challenged. This did go before the Supreme Court in 1944, towards the end of the war. There would be a Japanese American that would sue the U.S. government, and it made its way to the courts. And that court case became known as Korematsu versus the United States. Perhaps not shockingly, I don't know, the Supreme Court ruled that the Japanese American internment order was constitutional because it was labeled a wartime defense measure. They saw it as reasonable within wartime. The reasoning here, sadly, I think there are many examples throughout our history in which we have basically taken a timeout on civil rights in wartime. We saw this. I mean, even Abraham Lincoln signed off to end habeas corpus during the Civil War. We saw, American Revolution. We saw John Adams sign bills that basically made it illegal to speak out against the government. We saw, there's been a lot of World War I. Same thing. Wilson signed off on laws that silenced the freedom of the press. So this is sadly just the next stage in the long list of civil rights violations. But shockingly, the Korematsu decision did keep the internment camps open for another year or two. And I will say that they were wrong in this decision. I think that's quite evident. And if you don't believe me, you can believe President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. He would basically say as much. And in fact, the Japanese American survivors of this and their families did receive reparations after it was decided that this was an illegal attack on their civil rights. And rightfully so. It's a painful part of our history, but man, it's one that we have to look at if we want to avoid this kind of stuff in the future. I will also mention, it says Germans and Italians in the United States. There were some Germans and Italians that got wrapped up, especially on the East Coast. There were some that were arrested. Numbers were not nearly similar. There were, as far as I could see, only about 5,000 people that were interned on the East Coast that were either German or Italian. There were regulations put on those people, though. Some of them had to carry IDs. That their property could be seized. I mean, there were definitely attacks going on them, but just not as visible as what we see with the Japanese American internment camps. The final section here, and this will be our last slide, the social impacts. What happens when you send millions of men, you tell them to leave their jobs and go fight overseas? Well, those jobs still have to be done. And for the most part, they were picked up by two groups within American society. First of all, women are going to be going to work in massive numbers, and they're going to be doing jobs that they've never been allowed to do before. You see the picture there of Rosie the Riveter. We'll talk about her in a second. Also, minorities. This is sadly still the time of the Jim Crow era, and segregation laws made it impossible for many minorities to find good jobs throughout the country. But again, when you have a massive evacuation of millions of white males in particular, those jobs do become open, and many minorities find work in areas that they couldn't have done so before. And I'll take a time out here because this war is going to have tremendous impacts on the civil rights. Era. The modern civil rights era begins after these millions of African Americans come back from the war and realize that when they were dining in the cafes of Paris, they were treated like any other person that walked through the door. But yet when they get back home, they're treated like dirt, less than dirt. We're going to talk about. You can see the picture in the upper right-hand corner. We're going to talk about a veteran who in his first days coming back from service, would literally be attacked and tortured, blinded because of this. So we are on the cusp of another major change in the United States, and it's starting right here. The seeds are being planted for the modern civil rights movement. But let's talk at the beginning there, women at work, Rosie the Riveter. Women begin working in industrial settings throughout the country. While men may be flying the airplanes and the tanks, driving the tanks, the women are building them back home. The number of women in the workplace rose from about 13 million at the beginning of the war to 19 million by the end of the war. So you see basically a 35% increase in women at work during this period. Also, like I said, minorities are going to find an opportunity that they've never had before here. America is segregated, and we have to remind ourselves of that. That evil would not go away for quite a long time. But minorities, and I should mention this, the military is still segregated as well. Blacks and whites were not supposed to fight next to each other. That's crazy to me that we could be fighting this war under the banner of democracy and freedom and equality, all that good stuff. But yet we're telling our black soldiers to head over to the front of the lines there to get in front of us to take the bullets. I wish I had time to talk about more examples, but the Tuskegee Airmen were one of the most famous, celebrated squadron of pilots, and they, previously black men were not given, that right to fly planes and to fight in that way, but they were proven to be capable. The Tuskegee Airmen, perhaps more so than anybody else, proved that African Americans could not only fight but become the best that we had to offer. And the Tuskegee Airmen, there's been multiple movies made about them. Just a heroic bunch that fought many battles for the United States. Moving down to the Zoot Suit riots, and this is kind of a sadder case within this context here. As you had thousands of young white males that have either been drafted or signed up for the war, as they're moving out to their locations to be shipped off, sometimes they clashed with populations that they never encountered before. And in particular in California, in Los Angeles, you had a series of what were called the Zoot Suit riots. The Zoot Suit was kind of a popular wear for many Latino men in Southern California at the time. Big baggy clothing, big baggy suits that were very identifiable, long chain wallets, things like that. And for days, these riots actually lasted for days. They're 10 days of chaos and violence that happened in the spring of 1943 after some young Latinos had actually been attacked by U.S. servicemen who were about to ship out. So there was some clashing there between minority groups. So there's still a lot of racial struggle happening here in the United States, even as America's going off to fight this war in the name of democracy. Moving down to the civil rights impact, like I said, we are on the cusp of a major era of U.S. history, and there are some positive things that are coming out with it. We're seeing the beginning of the ends of segregation right here. Executive Order 8802 was signed by FDR, and what this did was outlaw discrimination in the war industries. Okay, so if you went to work in a factory that made tanks or planes, you could not be discriminated against based off your skin color. Okay. Now that doesn't apply to all society. But they were having too many problems, at a time where you couldn't really take time to argue, black and white. We got to make tanks. We got to make bombs for these guys to drop. So we got to get to work. And FDR understood that, passes this order. And this is one of the first desegregation orders that we see and anti-discrimination orders that we'll see from the government. It also created what was called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which kind of established a board that would investigate claims that there had not been fair employment practices occurring, or there had been violations, discriminations, things like that. So that was passed in an executive order. And immediately following the war, 1948, that's 3 years after the war would end, we see that President Truman would actually desegregate the military. So, for all minorities that were fighting, and it wasn't just African Americans. We're going to talk about Native Americans fighting later on, but this proving the fact that they are willing to fight and die for this nation. 3 years later, Truman will desegregate the military. We're seeing those pillars of Jim Crow come toppling down. The final section I want to discuss today is the economic impact, and again, this focus on what's happening here at home. War bonds. One big difference between the United States and the rest of the world, really, is the vast amount of capital, of money that we have in the United States. Now, while most of that is in the hands of individuals, the U.S. government obviously has an opportunity to raise funds among our civilians, whereas other poor nations don't have that, right? Russia, they're not doing that kind of thing. Massive poverty there. But we are able to supply weapons to basically all of the allies because we are able to raise money from our own citizens through war bonds. So these bonds were used to help pay for the war, but the government would offer bonds. The most common was a $25 bond that you could purchase for $18.75. And a few years later, if you held on to it, you could cash it in then for $25. So you hand over your money immediately, and then a few years later, you kind of get some interest back on top of your original loan to the government. To tell you how successful this is, and I believe this is, I don't know if all told, out of all the war bonds that are sold, $100 billion worth. $100 billion. Again, that is separating out what America is doing from the rest of the world. No one else is doing that, raising that kind of money to fuel our war industry. That's just not happening. Also, mentioning industry, moving down to number 2, wartime industry. What we are seeing is that the government is asking industries to switch over from making civilian products to war products. So we saw this in World War I. I mentioned it in our notes, but we are changing from a consumer-based economy to a war-based economy. Automobile factories like Ford, GM, they're starting to make planes and tanks. They're starting to make Jeeps. They're starting to do things that will help the war effort. The overall, throughout the country, there'd be over 200,000 companies that would switch their production in order to make something for the war. So that's a tremendous amount. And I know, again, I mentioned my grandfather at Pearl Harbor, but I know on my dad's side, both of my grandparents worked for Boeing here in Kansas City, helping make planes during this period. So this is something that America is going to work. And again, we're coming out of the Great Depression. So remember, 25% of Americans had been unemployed. So this is going to be a tremendous economic boom to us. But man, there's just no other country on earth that has the type of industrial power that we have and the ability to flip a switch like that. So I am reminded of just something I've read in the last week, of course, with the coronavirus happening right now, that the government has asked what companies that can start producing things like masks to help healthcare workers to switch over and start making those. And I've seen many have actually started doing that. So, we do have that tremendous ability to switch our industry at critical times of emergency. And man, it's one reason we won this war. Without our industry, I don't know that we would have done it. And then the final item for today deals with rationing. I know we talked about rationing in our Great Depression unit. I had mentioned, remembering my grandmother, taking an aluminum foil off the leftovers, and after she was done washing it off and then drying it, putting it back in she had grown up rationing because she lived in this time. She grew up where, you didn't throw away something that you could use again. So rationing is when you are limiting the goods you consume. And specifically for this rationing, they're doing it for military use. So not only would people save, their metal, like tin cans, they would save for the war effort. Even lard, people would they would actually save like their bacon grease, and they would make ammunition out of that. So that type of rationing, but also using less. Okay, the head of every household in America got what was called a rationing book, and for the start of my next video, I'll try to find, I have a couple here, but they got a rationing book, and basically it was a coupon, kind of a stamp that you would get for the month on basically to buy milk. You would have to produce a stamp from your ration book. That was the only way you could actually buy milk. It stopped people from hoarding food that was needed, but it also limited how much we were actually using. Beef, sugars, fats, all that were rationed. Other supplies, gasoline, of course, is going to be heavily rationed. That's going to be very important. Aluminum, steel, rubber, okay, for tires, things like that. In fact, kids would actually put together ration drives where they would lead scrap drives where they would go around and collect cans for the war effort back home, and you could actually trade them in even for more ration tickets if you wanted. Another final form, the victory gardens. You had many of Americans that would actually start planting their own gardens to again limit the amount of food that they were having to purchase from their local stores, which ultimately would allow for more food to be shipped overseas for our soldiers. So, Americans get pretty creative. This war, there's so much about this war. It's not just about the major battles. This war is won because we were able to mobilize millions of Americans. We were able to switch over our industry. We were able to use our capital. There were so many things that went into this war. It's not just the fighting that helps win wars, but it's the supply line. And man, America's doing a great job of getting that moving. So next time we meet, we will discuss some of the major battles of World War II and talk about the U.S. strategy on how to defeat the Japanese Empire. And I believe we'll leave off with talking about the invasion of of the German Europe at this point, and the invasion known as D-Day. Thanks for stopping by, and as always, please feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to get back to you. If you hopefully you've been jotting down some questions throughout this process, feel free to email those to me. I'll try to check in with a live video here later in the week, and you're more than welcome to ask me any questions at that point. All right, guys, thanks a lot.